Welcome, everyone, to IGP Elections Rapid Response webinar. I am Keren Yarhi-Milo. I'm the Dean of SIPA, the School of International Public Affairs here at Columbia University, and the Adlai Stevenson Professor of International Relations. What a remarkable week it has been. On Sunday, President Biden announced he was ending his re-election campaign and endorsed Vice President Kamala Harris. His endorsement was followed by a rapid coalescence of support for Harris for Democratic lawmakers, most recently President Obama, including all of her also serious rivals for the nominations. Now, questions are no longer about who will be on top of the new ticket, but whom Harris will choose as her running mate. And within the span of 2 days, Harris raised a record-breaking $126 million and counting, and emerged as the party's presumptive nominee. And in an address from the Oval Office on Wednesday, President Biden offered his support for Harris as his successor, saying he has made a decision to step aside to pass the torch to a new generation. Now, never in our nation's history has a president abandoned their election bid this late in an election cycle. And public concern about President Biden's age and electability intensified earlier this month following a poor debate performance that sparked a crescendo of pressure for him to exit the campaign. Now, his decision to step aside caps off an unprecedented past few weeks in American politics, which has led to a significantly increased sense of urgency and anxiety across the nation and the globe. Meanwhile, the Republican Party has also had a momentous past few weeks after the shocking assassination attempt of Donald Trump. The former president emerged from last week's Republican National Convention in Milwaukee with a party united and energized behind him, along with the young vice president nominee, J.D. Vance, who is poised to lead Trump's brand of populism well into the future. This election will define America's future domestically as well as a global power. A week ago, the polls showed that the Biden-Harris team would likely lose. Polling since Sunday already suggests some movement toward Harris, but with 100 days left to go, this race is far from over. This brings us to today's webinar. The purpose of SIPA's Institute of Global Politics Rapid Response webinar is to convene our faculty, fellows, and outside experts to provide unbiased analysis in real time on big breaking news event. Now, this webinar will kick off IGP's 2024 election programming, which will include a series of panels and roundtables on some of the most pressing election issues, from the economy to foreign policy to the battleground states. And today we've assembled an incredible panel of distinguished experts for today's webinar to discuss how Biden's exit will reshape the election, how Republicans will respond to a presumptive Harris candidacy, and what history teaches about victory and about the stakes of this unprecedented presidential election. So let me now quickly introduce our 5 esteemed panelists. We have Timothy Naftali, who is a senior scholar at Columbia's SIPA and the IGP, and a CNN's presidential historian. Tim is also leading IGP's 2024 elections programming, and we're happy to have him with us. Abby Phillip is anchor of CNN's Newsnight with Abby Phillip. Thank you, Abby, for joining us. Christina Greer is Associate Professor of Political Science and American Studies at Fordham University and Adjunct Associate Professor here at SIPA. Elizabeth Saunders is a Professor of Political Science at Columbia University and a member of the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies here at SIPA. And last but definitely not least, our own Robert Shapiro, the Wallace Sayer Professor of Government and a Professor of International and Public Affairs here at SIPA, as well as an IGP affiliated faculty. Thank you all for being with us. And let's start, Abby, let's start with you. you are covering the latest on the 2024 presidential election day in and day out. What should we expect to happen in the coming months in the DNC convention in Milwaukee? Who's rumored to be the running mate? Will we have a debate with between Trump and Harris, so forth? So, Abby, if you can bring us to speed with the latest.
Well, it's great to meet with all of you. Those are all the million-dollar questions, because the reality is that what can we expect? I think we can expect really the unexpected. We all knew that this was going to be a pretty volatile presidential cycle, and it's proven to be just that. Even more so, obviously, because we're witnessing a lot of things that really don't have much precedent. And I think with that, we should go into the next few weeks and months with a fair amount of humility about what really is going to happen and what it all can mean. I will say, though, that where we stand now in the race, as I think you put it really well, Keren, it's that the race is now an actual competition between a Democrat and a Republican. And in this country, those kinds of contests are very close. And that's exactly what we are still seeing right now with Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket. She is more competitive than Joe Biden was against Trump, but she's still at a disadvantage if you look at the electoral map, and if you look at the national picture of the race based on polling as we speak right now. That being said, when I talk to Democrats and I talk to Democrats in those swing states, they feel right now that she is competitive in a way that Biden was not, that she has opportunities that Biden did not. And so I think that we can see really, we can expect to see really the nuts and bolts of her campaign shifting into high gear. One of the challenges for President Biden was that he just simply had a hard time articulating the message. And she has much less of a difficult time with that. I also am starting to see a slight reframing of the message around her strengths, talking more about obviously reproductive freedom being a really key part of the campaign, but also because of her youth, she's younger, in her 50s, she has an opportunity to talk about the future, and about her role in creating a new future for the country that I think is changing the message in interesting ways, appealing to younger voters, and appealing to voters who want to turn the page. And so we'll see how all of that goes on. Right now, you brought up the debates. They're two big questions. Who will she choose as her vice president? Where are the debates? I'll give you my two quick things on the vice presidential search. Talking to people around her, talking to a lot of Democrats. There's a lot of people on the list, but there are really two to three top contenders. It's the obvious ones: Josh Shapiro from Pennsylvania, Mark Kelly from Arizona, and Roy Cooper from North Carolina. There's a lot of warmness toward Mark Kelly around people who are close to Vice President Harris. I think they think that he has a good biography, he helps her on immigration, and he kind of has a portfolio that they like. But it's really anyone's game at this point. And on the debates, as everyone probably has seen, Donald Trump is trying to back out of them. I still think there will be debates. I think he will really need to show up at some kind of debate. The question is, when is it going to be held, and will it still be with ABC News? And I think that's still pretty much up in the air at this point.
So, Abby, let me pick up on something you mentioned. So the last time we had an acting vice president who was the presumptive candidate for president was Al Gore in 2000. Now, Vice President Harris has been largely in the background in the past few years. So let me ask you, how does she stake her own path and credibly break from the policies of the Biden administration? And if she were to break significantly, in which direction, to the left, to the center, and on what issues?
I don't think that we will see a huge amount of breaking. It's really not going to be particularly easy for her to separate herself from the policies that she's been touting up until this very moment. I mean, voters are willing, I think, to give people the benefit of the doubt, but they're not gonna pretend like what just happened 2 weeks ago didn't happen. So I think that there's a limit to how much of that she can do, especially on issues like the economy. We do have, there's been some partisan polling from Democratic firms that suggests that on the economy in particular, on inflation, on quality of life, again, voters are willing to give her the benefit of the doubt about what she will do in the future that might improve their lives. So maybe there's an opportunity there. But I think just yesterday we saw her doing something really important when she had that meeting with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. I think that that's a microcosm of how you might see her stepping out a little bit. She didn't break from the Biden administration's policies toward Israel in any way, but she articulated a more nuanced approach to the issue that gave really strong voice to concerns about Palestinian casualties. She gave voice to concern about human rights abuses, allegedly that global groups have raised about how Israel is conducting the war, but she didn't back away from calling Israel an ally, for defending Israel's right to exist, and the stated United States policy on that. So she's articulating, what the Democratic base wants to hear more of in a way that Biden, frankly, struggled with. I think we just have to be honest that communication was challenging for President Biden, and she's showing that there's a yearning in the Democratic base to have somebody who can just talk about these issues in a way that reaches people better. And the policy, I don't think, is all that different, but Israel heard a different message, and they're responding to that today. And I think we're already starting to see her really staking out new ground.
Yes, we will get back to the Middle East in a second. Thank you, Abby. Team, let's put this in kind of an historical perspective. Let's talk about the historical significance of Biden's decision to drop out so close to an election. And there are really just two precedents in modern U.S. history, right? We have Harry Truman in 1952 and Lyndon Johnson in 1968. Both Truman and Johnson were former vice presidents. In both cases, the candidates that replaced them were defeated by Republican opponents, as you pointed out in last March, I think, in the Atlantic. So is there a fear of history repeating itself here? And what lessons, if any, can be taken from the case of the Truman and Johnson? And how can Vice President Harris really avoid a similar outcome?
Well, as Abby just said, we've never had a direct parallel to what's gone on this summer, particularly in the last month. There are echoes, and the two are the echoes that you've just mentioned, Keren. In 1952 and 1968, there were incumbent presidents who were expected to run again, who did not run again, but they announced their decision in March of the election year. And in that era, you didn't have a Super Tuesday, so you didn't have the primaries were not front loaded, and frankly, they were still less important than they have become at this point. So the parallel is not the same. There was ample time for the Democratic Party in both cases to choose a new top of the ticket. There's another big difference. In both cases, Truman and Johnson were weighed down by an unpopular war where Americans were fighting. In the case of Truman, it was Korea. In the case of Johnson, it was Vietnam. Whichever Democrat followed them, unless that Democrat took an entirely different approach to the war, that Democrat was likely to be tarred by the unpopularity of that overhanging policy issue. There isn't an overhanging policy issue with the same resonance today as there was in 52 and 68. There are issues from the Biden presidency that might be weaknesses, or certainly issues that Kamala Harris will have to address, such as immigration, such as the cost of living. And the inflation rate is going down, but prices are still higher. But there isn't a Vietnam and there isn't a Korea. So I believe that gives the Democratic replacement a chance that they did not have. It wasn't quite as, it was more difficult in 52 and 68. The second difference, and that's, again, one of the surprises of this most incredible month. I start the month with the debate on June 27. It's how quickly the Democratic Party, as you mentioned, Keren, has unified around a new candidate. In 1968, Lyndon Johnson did not endorse his vice president. He endorsed no one until after the convention. In fact, there is ample evidence to prove that Johnson had delusions that he might be the candidate after all, that by draft at the 68 convention, he would be chosen. So the 68 convention was chaotic, and it hurt the Democratic Party because it was a symbol of chaos. It meant the party wasn't unified. Well, that's not likely to be the situation in Chicago this time around. The Democrats have very quickly unified, and just today, I believe, President, as you mentioned, President Obama endorsed Vice President Harris. So we have a much more unified party than was the case in 1968. We don't have the overhang of an unpopular war in which Americans are fighting. And so I would say that Kamala Harris doesn't really have to worry about the weight of history as she pursues her own path to the White House.
Thank you, Tim. Now, let's discuss now from the Republican Party and its own coalition around Trump and his choice of Senator J.D. Vance as his running mate. And again, putting this in a historical perspective, Vance, I mean, initially was a vocal critique as a populist who's poking out not only against immigration, but also big banks, Wall Street, corporation, and all of this. So again, putting this in historical perspective, how far has the party evolved from the Reagan era, now with both Trump and J.D. Vance on the ticket?
It is unrecognizable from the Reagan era, with the exception of its social policies. Even there, Trump is moving in a slightly different direction on abortion than the Reagan, the Reagan coalition moved. But on foreign policy, on economic policy, this party, this new Republican Party, is a party that is more populist than any Republican Party in modern history, and frankly, in many ways, sounded like a 19th century populist movement. I mean, when I was listening to J.D. Vance's speech, I was thinking I was listening to a speech from the 19th century. Commitment to protectionism, isolationist America. It's remarkable to see how Donald Trump has refashioned the party in his own image. And he's found somebody who can articulate it as if it were a coherent movement. Because one of the things J.D. Vance is doing for Trumpism is turning it into an ideology. Under Trump, it seemed like a collection of his whims. Under Vance, it seems to be a worldview, and it's a worldview, as I said, that really smacks of the 19th century, certainly not of the 21st century.
So thank you, Tim. And Elizabeth, now to you. One of the where we see kind of a break from the Reagan years is us thinking about foreign policy. So I'm interested in your take of the Trump-Vance foreign policy will look like in terms of China, in terms of Ukraine. In opposition to the Reagan cabinet of hawkish realists, we have a group that is much more isolationist, much more inward looking. So what might we expect from a Trump-Vance foreign policy? And then shifting to Vice President Kamala Harris from the Democrats, where do you see going to be the big breaks or changes in her foreign policy? Oh, I think you're muted, Elizabeth.
Thanks, Keren. It's really been fascinating, as you say, to watch the Republican Party shift from party of Reagan and a lot of continuity under both Bushes to this very sort of populist isolationist streak. And I think it's important to remember that there's always been a populist streak, an isolationist streak among voters in the Republican Party. Think of Pat Buchanan's initial success in the 1992 primaries. But it's always been kind of a current that never achieved sort of the ultimate prize, which is the presidency. And that all changed in 2016. And there's a lot of evidence from public opinion data that it was Trump's victory or seizure of the nomination in 2016 that shifted the rank and file, kind of even the GOP elites and ultimately GOP voters in this more isolationist direction. So that is the Trump stamp on the Republican Party. I think there's sort of three things to say about Trump and what he might do in a second term. One is Trump is all about speed, right? If you listen to him talk about foreign policy, he'll fix the Ukraine war quickly. We can get hostages in Russia home quickly, et cetera, right? He withdrew from Syria by tweet. So there is this sort of activist, let's do something really, really quickly that you constantly hear from Trump. And it's not as though there haven't been Republicans that did things, that major peace overtures or, decisions that were very different from what had come before. I think the difference is Reagan took a hawkish approach to foreign policy and then reached out using diplomacy to the Soviet Union, but that took a lot of groundwork, right? That was years in the making. And you know this as well as anybody having studied it, right? Trump skips all that stuff. And this is part of why he didn't bring home a meaningful agreement with North Korea when he went on that first meeting with Kim Jong-un, because there had not been that diplomatic groundwork. So a lot of foreign policy is about eating your spinach, right? You gotta sort of take your medicine and do the work, and then you're ready to do something dramatic. And Trump likes to do things fast and take the shortcut, right? That said, there are a lot of things he can do quickly just because if he wins, he will have the power of the presidency. So one thing I would look for is his views on NATO have been very, very consistent throughout his career. He does not like alliances. He really dislikes NATO. Congress has tried to step in and say, if you do anything with NATO, we want to have a say in it, but he can do an awful lot with the power that he would regain as commander in chief. He could just bring the troops home from Europe, right? He's got the power to do that. He could just not appoint an ambassador to NATO. So he wants to do a lot, and there's some things that require a lot of effort, and those are less likely to succeed. The other things he can do on a dime. And so the unpredictability and volatility is really kind of a hallmark of Trumpism. Apart from that, I would just say he gets a lot of we talk a lot about the unpredictability of Trump, but he really has had three extremely consistent views on foreign policy throughout his career. This is over decades before he won the presidency the first time. One, he really doesn't like trade agreements. He likes tariffs, so I'd expect, Biden continued his China tariffs. I'd expect Trump to take even more strong action on that. He, as I said, doesn't really like alliances. So that will be a big theme. And he's always shown admiration for dictators and authoritarians. And so I would expect the difference in a Trump 2 versus Trump's first administration would be he's got more experience and he's going to appoint people who will do his bidding. And so, the power of the presidency is enormous in foreign policy, and it'll all happen at rapid fire, and who knows where the final outcome will be.
Yes, there's a lot to unpack more on the foreign policy of both Vice President Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, and we will actually have another event in the fall dedicated specifically to the importance of the election on U.S. foreign policy. But Elizabeth, I want to pick your brain as a political scientist who studies the role of leadership and decision-making. You and I come from a similar work on similar issues as we consider the possibility of electing America's first female president. We know barriers to women's leadership persist across industries, and women continue to vastly be underrepresented in leadership roles. So can you just very briefly speak a little bit about what the literature tells us about the role of gender in political leadership, and what changes in style, tone, substance can we expect from a female president in the White House, or even in just kind of in the next couple of weeks as we see the election evolving?
Well, this is a fascinating question because there are questions about a sort of generic female leader, and then there's the particular, the proper name, right? Kamala Harris, and also the circumstances that she finds herself in. So
Right.
starting just with the question of gender and the use of military force, there is some evidence that female chief executives face pressure to kind of overcome the stereotype of being weak. And so they may feel more pressure to use military force in crises, to take tough stances and so forth. And there's some evidence in terms of how voters perceive them, and also evidence from the few female leaders that we have historical records of, that they did feel pressure and they took a tougher stance than we might otherwise expect. There's also the sort of she's a Democrat issue, and the Democrats have historically always been looking over their shoulder at the stereotype of the wimpy dove. This is part of what got Lyndon Johnson into Vietnam in the first place. So those are kind of the generic issues that we might expect her to feel some pressure, but there are some mitigating factors here. One is that she comes in, if she wins the election, she'd be following Joe Biden, who got out of Afghanistan and the circumstances of the withdrawal were tragic and really hurt him, but there was widespread consensus that it was time for that war to end. And I think the politics surrounding some of these military interventions have changed. It was Trump who made the deal with the Taliban, right? So there is a more sort of skeptical view of the forever wars, and so that may dampen the pressure somewhat on her to act tough for the sake of acting tough. The other big wild card here is just what will the Republicans do in the case of if she wins the election, and obviously Trump would have lost it. And so the question for the GOP is, are they going to continue this sort of isolationist foreign policy stance, or are they going to rediscover their hawkish Reagan-esque kind of roots? And would they attack her for being kind of weak in a crisis? Or, it's harder to do that if the isolationist wing kind of remains dominant. So I think that there is this sort of like premium that women pay for this weakness stereotype, and that Democrats pay. But I think that there's some factors that might actually kind of reduce that premium in her case.
That's great, and a lot more to talk about the gender aspect. But I want to move, Christina. Can we? So, if you're thinking about the Vice President Harris, she will likely, as we said, to be the second woman to earn a major party's nomination for president. The other one was our own Secretary Hillary Clinton. What voter constituencies will be critical to her success, and whose support does she need to work hardest to earn if she's going to win?
Well, Keren, you started off saying it's been a week, and I was like, hasn't it been a year in this week? I mean, we've been through a lot. So the vice president, first things first, young people, right? Young people have been on the sidelines. They weren't terribly enthusiastic about Joe Biden. They felt that an octogenarian and a late stage septuagenarian weren't two individuals they were terribly excited about. We've seen Kamala Harris move to the top of the ticket has been a real adrenaline boost, and for the entire Democratic Party. So just like Barack Obama in 2008, I think getting young people off the sidelines and interested in so many topics that directly relate to their lives, whether it's reproductive justice or debt forgiveness or climate change or infrastructure and occupations, and as Elizabeth just laid out, our foreign policy, all of these things affect young people very explicitly. And I think the second one is white women. Black women have proven time and time again that they are 95% loyal to the Democratic Party, keeping not just the Democratic Party but democracy alive writ large. Same with Black men. They're not as robust as Black women, but they're by and large roughly 89%. So those two groups are significantly more participatory in the Democratic Party than any other racial and ethnic group. Last night, I think many of people who are paying attention, saw that, white women broke the internet and Zoom and, came to the call. But we have to remember, our colleague, Jane John from USC, who wrote the powerful article in 2016 called Hiding in Plain Sight. And she showed statistically with the data and the research that from 1952, when we started collecting this data, to 2016, but it extends all the way through 2020, white women have not voted for the Democratic Party candidate. They've only done so twice, in 1964, LBJ, my favorite president, and 1996, second term Bill Clinton. They didn't vote for the Democratic president in 1992, Year of the Woman. They didn't vote for the Democratic candidate in 2008 when it was Barack Obama, or 2016 when it was Hillary Clinton, or 2020 when it was Joe Biden. So if Kamala Harris is to be successful, white women are going to have to expand that base by and large, and not just sort of that 33 to 35% that sort of oftentimes says, hey, I did the right thing, thinking about reproductive justice, but actually pulling their friends and family members, their husbands and their, parents along to help them understand the economic consequences of a potential second term of Donald Trump.
And tell me, in the battleground states especially, what are the indicators that you're going to be monitoring and looking for besides the women? Is there anything else or trend over time?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm also, Abby mentioned this, but, I'm curious as to who Kamala Harris will choose as her VP. It's like, so we think about, Bashar in Kentucky. Well, I mean, he has been very successful in Kentucky, but the Democratic Party hasn't necessarily been very successful in Kentucky. So pulling him out of Kentucky, what does that really give the rest of the Democratic Party, right? Same with Cooper in North Carolina. North Carolina can be a swing state for sure, but by pulling him out, does that really harm North Carolina in the long run? Especially when we think about sort of how Republicans have been supporting Cornel West to make sure he's on the ballot there. Pennsylvania, we have to recognize that, Shapiro has done a great job, but it's 2 AGs. So, what are we expanding the base? What are we doing? And we also have to recognize that anti-Semitism is real in this country. And so that is, I'm sure, another factor that she's thinking about. And I think the Democrats need to make sure that they don't want to do what Donald Trump has done with J.D. Vance. You don't want to sort of double down on someone who's kind of like the lighter version of you. You want to expand the base. I do think that Donald Trump thought that he was going to go against Joe Biden, and the signature issue would be he's old. Well, that's no longer the issue. So whoever, the selection piece, all the potential candidates are roughly the same age as Kamala Harris. So it is a young and vibrant ticket. And I think, the Republicans are looking at a little bit of buyer's remorse with a J.D. Vance, who's only 39. But as, Tim said, his ideas are quite antiquated. And we think that we're looking at someone who's from our grandparents' generation, even though he's 39 years old. And it also gets complicated with the racial and ethnic element, because Republicans can't go full racist, because if you start as Indian American.
Thank you, Christina. So the two things that I want to pick up on, Bob, to you and then Abby. So Bob, you previously spoken about the big enthusiasm gap between Republicans and Democrats, and now we see, I mean, as Christina and others have said, it is kind of, the internet memes that are going viral and the enthusiasm among the Gen Z so far, the Gen Z voters. Do you think she will sustain the level of enthusiasm that she's generated? Or do you see the risk of her peaking early before the elections? What the data or history or patterns can teach us about this?
Okay, the thing that we've seen is the Democrats have narrowed the enthusiasm gap. So we can now think about this election as the kind of close election that we had in 2016 and 2020. Now keep in mind, here's how close we're talking about. 2016, Trump won the election by 70,000 votes in 3 states. Biden in 2020 won that election by 40,000 votes in 3 states. So we're talking about a close election. And what's at stake here? I wanted to fill in something that's really important here. What's at stake in this election is the potential for either party to win this election with unified party government. And this is huge, because with unified party government, we can see dramatic changes in public policy as a result of that. We saw that with Obama and Obamacare. We saw that with Trump and tax policy. We saw that with Biden, with all kinds of things that he did. So the stakes here are very close. And in terms of the enthusiasm gap being closed and how the election has gotten closer, we've seen the recent polls. The national vote is within 1 or 2 points, depending on what poll. We're talking about polls in the last week. In the key states now, and we all know what the basic key states are. They've mostly narrowed to about 2 points, and then a couple states like North Carolina and Nevada, we have not had recent polls. But the framework for looking at this, and just if you bear with me for a second here, My framework for looking at this is that Hillary Clinton in 2016 lost the election because Trump got Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, the blue wall. Keep in mind, Trump only needed one of those states to do it. So those states are really important. Things changed in 2020. Biden made inroads in Arizona and Georgia. Wow. The thing that's changed now is you've got those states in play. In addition, because of the census and redistricting, the Republican states have picked up 3 electoral votes because particular states have lost because they've lost population, they've lost electoral votes. And I won't go into the weeds of the calculation, but this is an arithmetic game here. So if you and then the further thing that's changed in the current polls is all of a sudden Nevada is in play with 6 electoral votes. So that's really changed the calculation in a big way. Now, just circling back to close on unified government, the Senate races now.
Yeah.
The irony is that while Biden was doing poorly, the Democrats in the Senate that the Democrats were worried about were doing well. The current state of play in the Senate is that it looks like with Manchin gone and John Tester running close, the Democrats need Tester to win in order to break even at 50-50. And the control of the Senate is going to hinge on who wins the presidency. And in the House of Representatives now, we're talking about the generic vote with being within 2 points. So that's close as well. So the stakes here are huge, not only for the presidency, but for unified government.
And on the continuation, this is fascinating. I mean, I want to hear you talk more about the really the math behind this, but just talk a little bit about the fact that she entered the race at this point. Should we expect to see this level of enthusiasm continuing, growing, peaking at some point? Where do you think, is there a ceiling effect that we're going to hit at some point?
I don't know what the ceiling effect is because as Christina Greer talked about, she's making inroads among certain groups, and it's a question about how much momentum she can have among those groups. At the same time, she may be losing further support among white voters, and she could still lose support there. Also potentially among older voters as well, where Biden had done very well. But in terms of the peaks and cycles of enthusiasm, I think the current enthusiasm is probably peaking now. Her announcement of the vice president will produce an additional surge. The Democratic National Convention will produce additional surge. Then we'll have to see where things play out there. The news cycle here is very important. That is delaying the announcement of the vice president. It gives her a chance to be in the limelight in a big way again.
So Abby, I want to turn to you. How does the fact that Vice President Harris now is the nominee complicate Trump's strategies to retake the White House? Given also not just what we heard about the math, but also given his record on issues of gender, race, and other cultural identity issues.
Well, for starters, the Trump campaign was largely built around running against Joe Biden, who was a historically unpopular president. It was built around attacking him over his age, his lack of fitness, his weakness, because the contrast of weakness versus strength was such a major theme when you looked at the Republican National Convention, which, believe it or not, was just 1 week ago. But that was a major theme for them. And so this changes the race for them to a degree, because as you alluded to, they do now have to navigate around race and around gender. And frankly, Trump has always struggled with that. I mean, you're already seeing him saying, I'm not going to be nice anymore. He's pulling out the nicknames. His allies are calling Harris a DEI hire. So there's a lot of really confusing messaging for the voters out there that is centered around her identity and less centered around the strongest issues for Republicans, which is the economy. And you could even argue on foreign policy, Trump felt like they were on pretty strong ground. The argument there was pretty simple. The world didn't feel like it was blowing up when I was president, and now it actually is. And you can disagree about the facts around that, but that was the message that they were conveying to voters. So the race has changed. It's going to be different, but we're talking a lot about the opportunities for Democrats because they are the ones who just had a major change in the top of their ticket. And there are some new opportunities that Harris had that Biden didn't have, but we should also acknowledge that she's not like a brand new figure on the stage. She ran for president in 2020 in a primary that pushed her very far to the left. She is still going to have to deal with her record, her statements from that era. She's still going to have to deal with her record and statements as vice president to this administration. One of the most challenging issues is going to be her role or lack thereof on immigration. So those are going to be things that they will have to address in this race, and it's not going to be easy for her to navigate them. I think the Trump campaign is retooling as we speak, but you are going to see them talking about her comments around defund the police. We're hearing that already. CNN has some new reporting this morning about old statements that she made in a radio interview that suggested support for that idea. You're going to hear them talking about the border and trying to lay the blame at her feet. That's not the full truth, but they're going to try to do that. And you're going to try to see, you're going to see them talking about just trying to attach the economy and inflation and people's struggles with affordability at her feet. One of the things that I'm seeing in the data, as Robert was just talking about, it was a great overview of what's going on there, but consolidating the Democratic base is still the major challenge for Vice President Harris. The recent New York Times Siena poll showed that she's running behind the Biden-Harris campaign's 2020 performance with Black voters to a degree that is significant. So you're seeing that erosion is still showing up in the numbers right now. That has to be rectified. Plus, she has to improve among independent voters. Plus, she has to attempt to get closer to Biden's performance with non-college educated white voters in the 2020 election. Those are steep challenges for Kamala Harris. And so there's a lot of work for them to do.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so let's talk, I know we're already mentioned the stakes in this election, but one aspect that we haven't really touched on is the issues of violent rhetoric and political violence. And as we said, we saw this, it was very disturbing with the attempted assassination of Trump, really horrible that we got to that point. Bob, to you, you co-authored a new book, Hate Speech and Political Violence, Far-Right Rhetoric from the Tea Party to the Insurrection, where you trace the evolution of extremist rhetoric in the right-wing political discourse from the Tea Party to the Trump era. Now, I want to ask you, is political violence, now either from the far right or from the far left, here to stay and potentially set to escalate in the next couple of months and after the election?
Oh, I think the threat of political violence is real. I mean, the book talks about the roots of this with the rise of the Tea Party, and especially Donald Trump with his birther conspiracy and all of that. He basically changed the norms of political rhetoric with regards to the kind of language that can be used and the kinds of threats that can be posed and stated by political leaders, where he basically supported his supporters beating up on people and so forth. I'm just overstating this for effect here. So the norms have changed. Fast forward to January 6th, obviously that was unprecedented and has set a new level of threat for American politics in the context of elections. That threat still looms 2024 if Trump loses. What will he do? The one thing that's different is that if that happens again, Trump isn't president, Biden is president, and in greater control of things than before. And we've seen violence there. We've also seen violence on the left and violence in the context of different protests. I think the violence that occurred by the protesters, the pro-Palestinian protesters, burning the American flag, carrying the Hamas flag, engaging with the police in violent activity, really shows the threat. And the thing to watch right now in terms of the next potential point of conflict is the Democratic National Convention. What happens if pro-Palestinian protesters engage in that kind of activity at the Democratic National Convention? That will pose a further threat. Also, it'll cause a disruption in politics where we'll see a case where disruption normally works against the incumbent party. We saw that in 1968 at the Democratic National Convention and the protesters there. And so both on the left and both on the right, there's an increasing threat of violence based on the rhetoric that's used and the increase and the visibility of certain violent acts.
So Elizabeth, let me just pick up on this because it's related to the Middle East. And can you say something about how the interplay between what we might be seeing coming out of the Middle East and how it's affecting what we're going to might be seeing in terms of the protests around the convention and leading up to the election?
Well, I think the first thing to say is the conventional wisdom, and I definitely I'm guilty of repeating it over and over, is that foreign policy typically doesn't play a big role in elections. I mean, I think the day that Biden gave his NATO press conference, which again was like 5 years ago, last week, 2 weeks ago, who knows? I couldn't help thinking that America was glued to a press conference about NATO, but of course it wasn't really, that wasn't why they were tuning in because they wanted to see how Biden would do, not because they care about the details of NATO. That said, because of what Bob and Abby have been highlighting, these small margins do really matter. And so there's been a lot of concern that the Biden embrace of Israel might cost Democrats, say, votes in Michigan with the Arab American community. I think a sort of underappreciated, real blind spot in research on public opinion and the use of force that's now sort of slowly being rectified is Black voters are not that supportive of military interventions, much less so than white voters. And so you do wonder whether that has kind of weighed down Biden's vote. And so that just presents another challenge for Harris. I do think her speech yesterday was very interesting. She came out after the meeting with Netanyahu. It was remarkable to see a vice president giving that sort of statement and not a president. And she walked a very fine line, but she said, "I will not be silent." And I think her acknowledgement and different tone and different message on the Israel-Gaza war may get her at least a hearing from people who were just not going to forgive Joe Biden for his wholesale embrace of Israel and so who can read a crystal ball about what will happen? I mean, I think protest dynamics are hard to predict, and sometimes what a protest is peaceful, except for the tiny little segment of people who go too far to the extremes, but that's what makes the news and that's what everyone remembers. So, if I knew the answer to this, I would be playing the lottery or something. But I do think that she does have the chance to kind of make a bit of a fresh start on the rhetoric, even though she can't really distance herself from Biden's policies entirely.
Yes, and of course we have to see, are we days away from a hostage deal? Are we closer to a Saudi deal that might be even just announced that it's, we're there? We don't know. But and Christina,
and also,
to your point,
I think it's also just important to remember that like Trump is sort of also an incumbent in this sense, and he bears some responsibility for his Middle East policies, having kind of led Hamas to the calculus that they were being totally shifted to the back burner with all this normalization. And, so there are ways that she can kind of turn it back on him a little bit. I mean, he was involved in the years leading up to this as well. But I think what you're suggesting is true of so many dimensions. We haven't even talked about the Trump's legal troubles, right? There are so many things that could happen between now and the election. It's 100 days. We could still fit 2 entire British elections into the time remaining. I followed that election very closely, and I keep thinking about that. People say, this is so short. It's like, probably fit part of a French one in there too, right? They had 2 rounds in like weeks. So Trump may or may not be sentenced in September. there's just to go back to Bob's point, the January 6th trial is off, but there may be a hearing that Judge Chutkan could hold that would unveil a lot of evidence in the public domain, and that may be enough to drive that back into the news. So, you know, there are so many inflection points still to go. It is dizzying to think about.
So this is the great. Now I want to conclude by going to each one of you. How, just for our students, for our viewers, how important is this election? And given how far apart each party is in terms of their view on the world and America's place in it, and a host of issues, I want to hear from you how you're thinking about this election and the stakes. Christina, I want to start with you.
Well, you know, I talk to my students all the time and they say, you know, well, every 4 years we hear this is the most important election. But I do think that this year might be actually the most important election. I mean, you know, reading through Project 2025 and that Donald Trump is trying to distance himself from, but, you know, if any of those policies are implemented, we are literally rolling back decades, if not borderline a century. And so for the issues that so many young people care about, to, you know, target this to our students, you know, if you care about reproductive freedom and justice, if you care about our global standing in the world, if you care about the environment, if you care about, you know, what jobs look like, or, you know, how inflation will affect your ability to buy a house, or, you know, work in the United States. I think, you know, so many of these issues are on the table. It's really, you know, as Biden did say, you know, this is the fight for the soul of America. Now, America's got a tarnished soul, if we're being honest about the history of this country, but we've made great strides over the past few centuries. And so I think, you know, there's been a confluence of a lot of issues about really coming to a reckoning of what this country has been and how one particular party is very comfortable in trying to pull it back to that divisiveness, to that second-class citizenship status for so many people in this nation, especially for women, people of color, and immigrants. So it's incredibly important. I think, you know, it's been alluded to, but we also have to be very careful about the misinformation and disinformation that is out there. And it's so easily sort of disseminated through so many different communities. And some communities are targeted more than others, whether it's Facebook or WhatsApp groups. So we have to sort of be vigilant about, you know, the rhetoric about Kamala Harris and her record as Attorney General or her record as the Vice President, and sort of making sure that we don't take things on face value, because this, I would argue, is the most important election of our lifetime.
Thank you, Christina. Bob? Oh, you're muted.
In this election, the stakes are high for the reasons I said, that actually have to do with the rationality of all the excitement and the emotion around the election. That is, either party can get unified government and move policy in one direction or another. The other thing, which remains an open question about, is whether or not this threat to democracy that the Democrats and others claim that the Republicans and Trump pose is real. The Republicans argue that rhetoric on the part of the Democrats is a conspiracy theory in and of itself, and that there are enough guardrails in place to control that. That's an open question right now, but that's at stake in the election, in addition to differences on policy issues that have become enormous over the years. The parties now differ on everything. Back in the 1950s, voters were upset that the parties were Tweedledee and Tweedledum, and there wasn't, you know, a dime's worth of difference between the party. Well, now there's an enormous gap between the party, and that can have significant consequences in the election. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Abby?
I honestly, I'm listening to what my colleagues are saying here, and I would just say that the reality is that if Trump wins, I think Americans will probably be in for the biggest divergence from the status quo compared to a continuation of a Biden administration. And this is going to be extremely important, because oftentimes voters want change. They want something different. That's one of the challenges often for incumbents. And so Trump has put on the table a vision for the country, policy-wise, tone-wise, frankly, that is radically different from the way that the country operates right now. Whereas, you know, the Harris campaign, the Biden-Harris administration thus far, they are arguing for a continuation of what people are currently experiencing. And so when it comes to how consequential this election is, I think that if we were to see a change of administrations, that would really mean a change. It would really mean a substantive difference with a president who has appointed now 3 Supreme Court justices, who's tilted the court in a conservative direction, who's appointed a lot of judges downstream of the Supreme Court. It's not a case of a lot of change in one direction and a lot of change in the other. It's really a lot of change in one direction and a lot of kind of continuation in the other. And so with that reality, I think that we have to be prepared for the fact that Americans have a penchant for wanting something different, even if that something different is radically, a radical departure from what they are currently experiencing. And that dynamic is what is going to make this election so volatile. As I think Bob said, it's not that common that the two parties are this far apart in terms of their vision for the future. And so for decades and decades, American voters often say, well, there's not really that much difference between the two parties. Well, now there is. And we will see whether or not change really drives the day, as it often has in American politics, or whether they will say, you know what, we may not love the way things are, but we don't want things to go completely in an unpredictable direction. And as I sit here now, I cannot tell you where exactly the sort of, it's going to be about 15 to 20,000 voters in this country who will decide this election, where those people are on that really key question.
Oh, this is so important. Elizabeth.
Yeah, I think I endorse all these points, and we do hear over and over every election is most important. And the political scientist David Mayhew, I think in the early, maybe it was Obama's reelection year, 2012, wrote a terrific piece, I think, in the Washington Post, where he said, okay, let's talk about what the most important elections were. How about 1860, right? So I do think that idea is very much overused, but you could say 2020 was crucial. The one sort of friendly amendment I might make to Abby's point, which I think is entirely right. I mean, the waking up to what's going on with Project 2025 that we've seen also in the last month. That's like another of the things that have happened in the last month. I do think shows that there's far more departure with Trump. But I do think there is this is an odd situation, because he's now not only the old candidate, but he's sort of the one. I mean, we know he's been in power before. It would be his second term. And it's just a strange oddity of the situation. So there is a sense that there would be dramatic change, but it would be something we have seen in the very recent past, and maybe just to a greater degree. So I also think one thing we just haven't mentioned is the power that it would be, the powerful moment it would be if Kamala Harris won and became the first woman president. Like I can't really even imagine what that will look like or feel like. I mean, it just that's a wild card to me. But you just go down the list, especially in terms of international affairs, and as Bob said, the parties are really far apart, and there are clear different outcomes than we could expect, right? On Ukraine, on Taiwan, for women around the world, not just in America, right? Women's rights. And I think that the other thing just to end on is, if we were having this conversation a year ago, October 7th hadn't even happened yet, right? That was not on anybody's radar, much less talking about an issue that would affect the election in any way, right? And so I think we just, events, dear boy, events. It's just, you can't escape presidents don't get to pick their crises. And so Trump would be a change candidate. Some things may happen in a Harris administration that will be dramatic that we just don't know about.
Thank you. Tim, the final word. is yours.
I want to step back for a moment and think about the consequences for our country that a man who sat in the White House during January 6th would be elected again to the Oval Office. I think a lot about the challenges of consequences and periods when there are no consequences. What are the lessons that young Americans will learn if the man whose responsibility it was to keep a country secure on January 6th did nothing for, what is it, an hour and a half, 2 hours, and then when he spoke, it really wasn't that helpful. Whatever you think about Donald Trump's responsibility as either an instigator or as a supporter or as an influencer for the events that we know as January 6th, he bears, I think, principal responsibility for the climate that produced January 6th. I'm not even talking about his first impeachment, nor am I talking about his promise to use the federal government to seek vengeance. So if that person is elected to the highest office in the land, it undermines President Biden's description of that office as a sacred office. And I worry about the lessons that our young people will learn, let alone the consequences over 4 years, but the lessons they will learn about power and responsibility. And I worry we need to develop less cynicism in our country, and I would hope a little more trust in our institutions. I see more cynicism and less trust if someone who was at the center of January 6th should become our president again. So for me, I see that it'll be another stress test. I think our republic can survive it. But I worry about the long-term consequences for the next generation of leaders in our country if they learn that you can do what Donald Trump did in his first 4 years and become president again. That's what I worry about in terms of the long term.
Thank you, Tim. And this is all the time we have, unfortunately. I really want to thank you, especially the panelists, for your insights, for sharing with us your assessment of where we are. There is a lot to cover in this election, in the race and the consequences of this. And this is why the Institute of Global Politics will dedicate a whole host, a series of events looking at different aspects. And we will be bringing Republican voices, Democratic voices. We will be bringing scholars and practitioners to talk about this, because we want our students to be informed. We want the audience to really understand what's at stake, how to think about it, put it in historical perspective, and really hope to learn a lot from this about not just our democracy, about politics overall. So please keep in touch. Visit the IGP website to learn more, and subscribe to our mailing list so you can join our next webinars and events in person. Thank you again, everyone, and have a great day.